Hi, this is Dr. Musil, and this is part one of lecture one, Introduction to Ethical Philosophy. In this part, we're going to discuss philosophy in general. Right? So we're here to discuss in this course, right, ethical philosophy. Okay, well, ethics, as we'll learn here in more detail shortly, is one of the primary categories of philosophy. So wouldn't it be of interest to us to discuss philosophy in general before we, discuss ethics in more detail? And so that's the thinking here, right? Let's talk a little bit about philosophy in general before we dive into a discussion of ethics. So in the first part, what I'm going to do is give you a historical breakdown of philosophy, okay, and then also give you a categorical breakdown of philosophy in this first part, and then we'll take a break. And then the second part of the first lecture, we'll talk about ethics in particular, right? We'll talk about the structure of ethics, the main categories of ethics itself, and sort of what we're going to be up to, what do the theories look like, and so on that we're going to be discussing for the rest of the course. So that's the game plan. Again, we're going to go back and discuss, to begin with here, the historical breakdown of philosophy. Before I do so, I wanted to preface everything by kind of making a couple prefatory comments regarding both of these, right? Both my historical breakdown and my categorical breakdown of philosophy. I'll say at the outset that, look, these aren't anything that are set in stone, okay? If you were to go ask different philosophers or read different textbooks, philosophical textbooks, intro to philosophy textbooks, they're going to maybe break things down slightly differently. I will say that, 999 out of 1,000 times, generally, right, most philosophers that I'm familiar with anyway, they're going to reference there being these four general eras of philosophy, okay? Where they'll differ is maybe on where one era ends and the next one, begins. And that's why I can't tell if you can tell, given the quality of the video here, but I put in approximation signs before all these dates, right? Because they aren't set in stone. I mentioned the fall of the Roman Empire as being the end of the ancient era and the beginning of the medieval era, but there might be other philosophers for whom that's not the case, right? They might end it a little bit later, a little bit earlier. But in general, and most philosophers, most textbooks, they do reference there being these four different eras, right? But I do want to acknowledge, right, that there is this maybe debate, not necessarily debate, but slight disagreement in terms of where these eras begin and end. So too, the same is the case with respect to any categorical breakdown of philosophy, especially more recently. I've offered here what I would suggest is or what I call at least the classical or traditional breakdown of philosophy. I would say up until like 20 years ago, this is pretty standard. Most textbooks you would come across, they would reference these four typical categories. But more recently, you might see 5 or 6 categories being referenced. Aesthetics or political philosophy is one that I see more and more often now as being its own kind of branch, as being, for whatever reason, distinguished from these others. Whereas, traditionally it was subsumed under these other ones. Okay? Just wanted to point that out at the outset. It's not anything set in stone. Okay? It can vary depending on who you ask. But nonetheless, I think it's helpful for us and for our purposes to give some sort of context for the subject in general that we're going to be studying, right? So hence the reason for us turning now to a historical breakdown of philosophy. And I will say from the outset, and I should let me mention from the beginning here that I'm going through, right, a printed version of the PowerPoint lecture. So if you're following along in PowerPoint, I'll try to mention when I'm sort of flipping, if you will, to the next slide or turning to the next page. And so, I'm flipping to the next slide here, which would be slide 2. Okay. So I've already mentioned, why are we here? Ethical philosophy. I talked about, the impetus for us discussing philosophy in general before we turn to ethics. Okay, philosophy itself, what does it mean? We all probably had a general sense of what philosophy was before we signed up for the course, and our general sense is probably right? We associated philosophy with deep thinking about fundamental questions of life. Why are we here? Why is there something and not nothing? What happens after we die? That sort of thing, and that's all very much true of philosophy. But what else should we associate with the term, right? That's our general colloquial sense of philosophy, but what is it really? And what it literally means is it's a Greek, it has a Greek origin. It comes from 2 Greek root words, philos and sophia. Philos typically being translated as friend or lover, and Sophia being translated as wisdom or knowledge. So that sounds pretty good, right? Friends or lovers of wisdom or knowledge. So, if you're a philosopher, you love knowledge, right? And so not only is it true, I guess one point I would make is not only is it true that we're concerned with truth in the capital T sense, right? What's really going on? Why are we here? And so on, but literally, right, we're concerned with knowledge, all the truths, all the lowercase t's as well. We want truth in general, all knowledge, all wisdom, right? Philosophers are drawn to knowledge in general, to truth in general, right? I mean, literally, and in my experience with all the philosophers I've met, they're concerned with truth in that deep-seated sense, but also in maybe more particular ways as well. So I think that's a point maybe worth mentioning that. And I guess kind of along those lines, I should point out historically, it makes sense that to point out, right, that philosophy, philosophers are concerned with all aspects of truth, not just the capital T, big, deep questions. If you go back to the ancient era, historically speaking, go back far enough, everything we would associate with these various distinct academic disciplines nowadays, psychology and so on, they were all subsumed under philosophy back then, right? They were all branches of philosophy, natural philosophy and so on. So, for example, psychology for the longest time was philosophy of mind. There was no such thing as psychology in and of itself as being its own distinct academic discipline up until I want to say, who was it, William Wundt, even maybe into the 19th century before it really was established psychology as its own academic discipline. Before then, it was kind of associated with philosophy of mind. So it makes sense again to kind of associate with philosophy, not just with the deep-seated questions, but all aspects of the truth. Right? Philosophers want to know. Right? Okay, so let's go ahead now and turn to the historical breakdown of philosophy itself. Okay, first of all, why even think of there being these distinct eras of philosophy? Okay? Why reference there being these, the ancient era, the medieval era, the modern era, the contemporary era? And the answer to that, or at least what I would suggest, is that you have different points of focus, right, or different themes that become more prominent with these different eras, right? So it's helpful in that sense then to think, to associate what happens in philosophy this time as the medieval era, right? Because there's certain things that are tend to happen more often than not in this time period versus this time period, and we'll see how that's the case as we proceed here and we talk about each of these eras in more detail. We'll see how, for example, with the medieval era, certain things are of more interest to the medieval philosophers than that is the case for the modern thinkers who are more interested in something different. And I should say from the outset that that's not to suggest that in focusing on certain aspects, and I'll just say it, right? Medieval thinkers, what do they tend to what was of utmost importance? Discussions of God, that sort of thing. But that's not to suggest, this is the point I was making, right? That they neglected other aspects of philosophy. No, all these aspects of philosophy were dealt with throughout the entire history of philosophy. But it is helpful to point out, I think, and that's the whole point I'm making here, right, is that there were these certain topics or aspects of philosophy that sort of come to the forefront with each of these eras. And that, I would argue, is the reason why philosophers think of there being these distinct time periods in the history of philosophy. So again, what are the different eras? We have the ancient era, the medieval era, the modern era, and the contemporary era. And without further ado, we'll go ahead and talk about the ancient era in more detail. So this is slide 4, or page 4 for me, but slide 4 for you if you're following along with the PowerPoint. Now the ancient, I just got through talking about how, why we think of there being these different eras. And that was because, well, certain things seemed like they were of slightly more importance, to these philosophers at these different times. I just got done saying that, but that's actually not the case for the ancients. What actually stands out for the ancient philosophers is that nothing stands out. They seem equally interested in all aspects of philosophy. And actually Aristotle is one of the perfect examples of that, because he seemed to have wrote on every aspect of life, right? He wrote, he has a book on botany, he has a book on politics, on poetics, physics, metaphysics. You name it, he seems to have written a book on it. And that's, again, indicative, I think, of the ancient philosophers in general. they tended to be equally interested in seemingly everything. So again, what stands out about the ancient era is that nothing really stands out about the ancient era. When did the ancient era begin, by the way? Roughly the 6th century BC. Again, no perfect pinpoint precise date to mention. And we'll say it ends with the fall of the Roman Empire, say 476 AD. Okay? And nothing set in stone, as we mentioned, but helpful to kind of throw those dates out, I think. Who are some of these ancient thinkers? Another thing I should mention real quick while I'm thinking about it, for better or worse, given mostly practical considerations, I'm more well versed in the Western tradition of philosophy, and we only have a certain amount of time. For better or worse, our course, we're going to be dabbling in just the Western tradition, right? Thinkers in the Western tradition of philosophy and what they've had to say in response to these moral issues and conundrums, right? By and large. Now there are some. We'll talk about Buddhism, for example, right? There are some references to some, writings and thinkers of the Eastern tradition, but by and large, again, for all those considerations I mentioned earlier, we're going to be talking mostly about the Western tradition. Okay? And I say that especially in the ancient, when discussing the ancient era, because I don't mean to suggest that or demean the Eastern tradition, right? That there are plenty of very solid contributions from the Eastern tradition, especially, and this is why I brought it up now, in the ancient era, especially in the ancient era. We mentioned the Buddha, but he's just one of many, right? So I wanted to make that point, right, and to acknowledge that there is a very rich Eastern tradition, a whole slew of Eastern philosophers who would have good things to say about all these things we're going to talk about as well. Okay, so who are some of these other ancient figures? The pre-Socratics, think Pythagoras. I don't remember much about high school, but I do remember the Pythagorean theorem: a squared plus b squared equals c squared, right? The pre-Socratics, so guys like Pythagoras, he's considered an ancient philosopher. Parmenides, the dude that said all is one. Heraclitus, kind of on the opposite end of the fence, he's the guy that said all is in flux. You can't step into the same river twice, right? Because everything's constantly changing. He was, for example, very influential on someone like Friedrich Nietzsche. All these guys were really super influential on a whole host of figures on throughout the subsequent history of philosophy. I mean, there's a reason why if you were to poll the average layman walking down the street and say, can you name a philosopher? 9 times out of 10, I would say whoever they're going to name is probably an ancient philosopher, a dude that died 2,000 plus years ago. Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. And there's good reason for that, right? Because these guys made huge contributions to philosophy. Okay, so anyway, Parmenides, Heraclitus, the Buddha, who we mentioned, but we'll be talking a lot in particular about 3 Greek major philosophers, the ones I just mentioned: Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. SPA, right? I like to have helpful acronyms: SPA, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. Now, what else is noteworthy about this order? That's their chronological order as well. Socrates was Plato's mentor, and Plato was Aristotle's mentor. Aristotle studied under Plato's in Plato's academy, his school of philosophy, for 20 years before and up until Plato died, and then Aristotle finally goes off and establishes his own school of philosophy. Anyway, who should you be familiar with? The big players are really Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. Okay, the Buddha is an ancient philosopher. You don't have to necessarily know specific dates, right? But you should have a general idea, right, of when the ancient era was, and when the medieval era was, and when the modern era was, and so on. And you should probably be familiar with the fact that, for example, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, and the Buddha, that those are ancient philosophers. But otherwise, don't worry too much about a lot of the detail here in terms of the quiz, okay? So moving on to slide 5, we'll transition then into the medieval era, which, again, we're going to suggest starts roughly with the fall of the Roman Empire, okay, 476. And then we'll say it's going to end the early Renaissance period, let's say the end of the 14th century or 1400. Let's just throw 1400 out there, nice and neat date, okay? I already alluded to this earlier. What's going to be a point of focus here for the medievals? Religion, right? God. I would say, not necessarily so much, does God exist? Okay, most of these guys wouldn't really debate that. Now they might debate what's the best proof of God's existence, but a lot of it was, it's one thing, does God exist, right? And then another issue is God's essence, right? Existence versus essence. And I would say a lot of the debate or a lot of the philosophy being done was regarding or revolving around God's essence. What is God's nature? What must God be like? Those sorts of things. But in general, right, those are the kinds of questions that were really of utmost interest to the medieval philosophers, what really stands out. Again, not to suggest that other aspects of philosophy were neglected ever, but those were the kinds of questions that really came to the forefront. Who are some of the big head honchos, if you will, the MVPs of the medieval era? The triple A, I like to say. St. Anselm, St. Aquinas, and St. Augustine. Oops. Forgot how to spell Augustine there. I think that's right. So, AAA, these are all fairly famous, medieval philosophers, especially Aquinas and Augustine. Anselm, he's more only known, in philosophical circles. He did have a very famous proof for the existence of God, known as the ontological argument. But otherwise, if you haven't taken philosophy before, you probably haven't heard of Anselm, but you might have heard of Aquinas or Augustine, right? These other two, and they were definitely medieval philosophers. They made huge contributions to philosophy. One thing that one theme I think that's worth commenting on is that you had a huge reverence, a deep-seated respect for the ancient philosophers on the part of the medieval thinkers. So, for example, Augustine, he was notably, known as a Plato scholar, and you can sort of see him wedding his religious beliefs with, Platonic views throughout his philosophy. And the same is true of Aquinas, who does the same thing but with Aristotle. In fact, having read both Aquinas and Aristotle, even their methodology, the way they write their philosophy is very, very similar, right? So the way they proceed, the way they talk, some of the same concepts and verbiage, very similar. And so that's Aquinas, right, showing, in some sense, respect to Aristotle. And so I think that's one kind of interesting theme is, again, you see the thought of these ancients sort of shining through and melding, if you will, with the religious views of these saints. Right? Okay, we'll transition or move on then. Here again, we're talking roughly 1400. We move on then to what we call the modern era. And what's the first thing we want to point out about the modern era of philosophy? It's not actually modern. So if your friend says, hey, you should go check out this modern philosopher named Joe Blow, don't go Googling Joe Blow trying to check out, when his next conference, his speech is, because if he's a modern philosopher, he's been dead for at least 100 years, right? So the modern era of philosophy, and you will see that referenced a lot. I mean, you hear about the modern era of philosophy. It was a very rich, as we'll talk about here in more detail shortly, very rich time period for philosophy. A lot going on, right? But it's not now. Okay, so modern means, again, roughly 1400 to what we'll say 1900. Okay, so about 500 years there, roughly. Modern doesn't mean now; it means that time period. And what happens? I don't mean to give the wrong idea, right? Like it's some battle between science and religion. No, that wasn't the case at all. But you do see some some newfound appreciation for objective kinds of knowledge and replicating what we say we know, or at least some general emphasis on knowledge itself, and what is it, and how do we go about verifying that we have it, and those sorts of things. Those kinds of questions become more and more important in this modern era, and as the modern era proceeds. So, not surprisingly, then, epistemology, which, as we'll see here shortly, is knowledge kinds of questions in philosophy, and metaphysics, which is what's real, what exists. Those kinds of questions come to the forefront, right? They are talked about at length. Okay, so metaphysics and epistemology were extremely significant in the modern era. As I mentioned a moment ago, this is a very rich period in the history of philosophy. You have tons of very well-known thinkers, that you've probably heard of, many of them that you've heard of, and many of them that we'll be reading throughout this course as well. Who are some of them we'll read? We'll read Kant, Immanuel Kant, John Stuart Mill, Nietzsche, Friedrich Nietzsche, but then there's a whole slew of them that we won't be reading that you probably heard of, like René Descartes, for example. Maybe you've heard of David Hume. So even, you know, thinkers that we won't be discussing, there's so many. Hobbes, Locke, John Locke would be another one. Ayn Rand. Anybody basically that did philosophy, again, between 1400 and 1900 is known as a modern philosopher. Okay? And I mentioned Immanuel Kant. That's a name that I think is worth sort of putting on your radar here at the outset. We won't talk about him too much until the second part of the course, but when we do, we'll talk about him ad nauseum. This guy, if you were to ask philosophers, so I mentioned earlier, you know, if you were to poll a layman on the street, can you name a philosopher, right? They would name a bunch of ancient philosophers. If you were to poll academic, you know, professional philosophers, if you will, and ask them to name the most important philosophers all time, they would cite all those ancient thinkers, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, but they would also throw in that same tier Immanuel Kant, for better or worse. Like him or hate him, still to this day, people are still writing into the philosophical journals saying why Kant is either right or wrong. So very important thinker, and I'm, for what it's worth, not a huge fan of Kant either. But there's no denying the huge role that he has played in the history of philosophy. So I just wanted to mention him in particular. Again, there's a whole, I don't have it offhand, but you know, I think it's lecture 11 or 12 is basically Kant. The whole lecture is basically what Kant says about morality. It's known as deontology. So again, very important figure, modern thinker. Another one we'll talk about starting lecture 3 is Thomas Hobbes. Lecture 4, John Locke. Okay, so some of these guys, again, you're probably familiar with. So that's the modern era. We talked about kind of what stands out, who some of the more prominent thinkers are, and so on. So we'll move on to slide 7 and the contemporary era. Okay, so we'll say it begins roughly the 1900, the beginning of the 20th century. Okay. Why this new era? Why suggest a new era begins here? Well, it's kind of an interesting story. A feud kind of emerged in philosophical circles. It had been boiling for a while, and it started, you know, it had its origins well before 1900, right? It had been brewing for a while, and right around the turn of the century, it just erupts. And you have, as a result, two competing camps in philosophy that emerge. You have the analytic camp or tradition, and you have the continental camp or tradition. Okay, and so this feud boils over, erupts right around the turn of the century. Hence, that's kind of the reason for philosophers suggesting there's this new era that emerged. And ever since, this feud is just as much alive to this day as it was, you know, back then when the contemporary era first began. And I can tell you firsthand, I will relay experiences here shortly, that this feud is very intense, and you know, it touches all aspects of philosophy, including, you know, where you're gonna have to study when you decide you are interested in philosophy. It's going to dictate perhaps where you're going to have to go live. More on that here in a moment. So this analytic and continental divide, if you will, the split. And what is the split all about? Well, you have some thinkers who are of the mindset, they're the analytic tradition, or the analytic camp, right? The people that belong to that camp. And they say things like, look, philosophy, really what it is, there aren't any substantial philosophical problems. Really what's going on is we're coming in and screwing things up with our crappy thinking and speaking. And what we need to do is improve the way we think and speak, and then we'll see these so-called problems slowly disappear, right? And then we've just muddied the water, so to speak, with our, again, crappy thinking and speaking. And so they have this huge focus, not surprisingly, then on language and logic, right? Thinking and speaking. So there's focus on language and logic. Okay. The Continentals, on the other hand, they want to say, slow down. No. I don't care how well you or how much you improve your thinking and speaking. there are serious, significant philosophical problems that can't be solved or that need our attention at the very least. Why is there something and not nothing? Okay, and no degree of improvement in our thinking or speaking can seemingly solve that sort of question, right? So there are these substantial philosophical problems, and again, the animosity between the two is palpable, right? The continentals think that the analytic, the people of that camp, they don't appreciate what it means to be human, right? They're just cold logic chopping machines, these analytic philosophers, which are focused on logic, right? They don't have any appreciation for what it means to be human, right? And a school of thought that's usually associated with the continental tradition is existentialism, which you might have heard of. Okay, so that's a school of thought that's associated with the continental camp, right? Again, the existentials are known for focusing on living our own lives, right? And accepting, the real nature of reality, and that there are these real problems associated with being human. So the analytic set of the continentals, so their heads are in the clouds. They're so mystical, you can't ever follow what they're saying, right? Because their language is too loose and so on. And so there's a lot of derision, aimed back and forth. And I can speak to that. Again, I mentioned earlier that I've experienced this sort of thing firsthand. So Boston College, right? So let me back up. There is this geographical correlation, right? So again, when you find out you're interested in philosophy, you're going to have to decide whether you are interested more in the analytic tradition or the continental tradition, because that's going to then dictate where you have to go to school. And what I mean by that is the analytic tradition is largely associated with the United States and Great Britain. And then the continental tradition is associated with Europe, especially France and Germany. So, if you want to study continental philosophy, you're probably going to have to move out of the United States if you're living in the United States, if you want to study it seriously, right? I mean, now that's not entirely true, right? But the point is, most schools, most universities in America, their departments of philosophy are heavily analytic, right? They're definitely associated with the analytic tradition. So say there's 300 academic departments of philosophy across the United States. I would say there's only 20 or 30, at most 10%, that would be associated with the continental camp. All the others are analytic. And so that goes then back to when I moved out to Boston, I got my master's degree at Boston College. That's actually one of the few that's associated with the continental tradition. They didn't care how many logic classes I had coming in, right? The way they taught their classes totally different than, when I would take a class at University of Kansas a few years later. So just the way the instructors would teach, totally different. The way they write their books, totally different. There wasn't that emphasis on language and logic out there at that school like there was then fast forward, when I went to get my PhD at the University of Kansas, heavily analytic school. That's the first thing they asked was, what's your experience with logic? And I had a couple classes, but they only accepted me. It was contingent on me taking this other logic class as well, as soon as I, was admitted. So totally, you can tell, again, to this day, the difference between the two, totally palpable in my experience. And I would also mention, within the first week I was at KU, I remember having this discussion with this other grad student, and I pulled out this book, and I'm like, have you read this? He's like, well, that's continental, isn't it? And I said, yeah. And he said, well, I don't read that crap. And he just dismissed it out hand, wasn't willing to read it or look at it any further, right? Knew it was associated with the continental camp and didn't want to have anything further to do with it. So it really is interesting. I think, I'm not a big fan of the divide. I think it's, in my opinion, stupid. Like I mentioned earlier, the continentals think of the analytics, right? They're cold logic chopping machines. No, that's not true. I went to school at KU, and there's lots of really good people there, right? And so too, the analytics say the continentals, their heads are in the clouds. You never know what they're saying. Well, that's not true either. I read philosophers of the continental ilk that are very clear in their writing, much more clear than some of the analytic writers. So I've never been a fan of this divide, but it is definitely there, and it definitely affects philosophy as an academic discipline to this day. And so that's really stands out about the contemporary era. There are many famous contemporary philosophers. Jean-Paul Sartre, who you probably heard of, Bertrand Russell, Ludwig Wittgenstein, Martin Heidegger is a little lesser known. Albert Camus wrote some pretty famous philosophical novels, The Plague, The Rebel, I think, The Stranger, so you might know of him. Jacques Derrida, another philosopher associated with the Continental Camp. So that is the contemporary era, so hopefully that gives you kind of a general sense of the history of philosophy. A lot going on, and certain things at certain times seem to, to strike their interest, people's interest or philosophers' interest, more than other things. So we'll go ahead and move on to, what is this, slide 8 for you guys, and we'll move past this historical breakdown and focus instead on the categorical breakdown here. I guess I'll leave that up there. So this will be much shorter than the historical breakdown, but basically there are 4 main categories of philosophy. The first one being, and I referenced all 4 of these at one point or another, I think, already, but epistemology is everything knowledge-based. What do we know? How do we know it? And those might seem like pretty straightforward questions, but they're not at all. What is knowledge? What does it even mean to know something? All right. Never mind what do you know. What does it actually mean to know something? This is a notoriously difficult problem for which there's seemingly no convincing answer to this day. Right. One example of a related issue that epistemologists have to sort of wrestle with is certainty. Right? Is certainty required to say you know something? In order for you to say you know such and such, right? Do you need to be certain of that or just pretty sure? Well, I've always been of the opinion, right? It wouldn't make sense to say you know something unless you were certain of it. Well, as epistemologists, as people like David Hume, a famous modern philosopher, pointed out, if you're going to require certainty, then it seems like there's very little, if anything, that we can know. Right? Because as he famously points out, it doesn't matter how many times something's happened in the past. For example, the sun rises in the morning. We don't know for sure with any degree of certainty, right, that it's going to happen tomorrow morning, right? So if you require this notion of certainty or this element of certainty, then it seems like we might not even know anything. And so then some epistemologists want to say, well, no, you don't have to be certain. Well, then that seems like a pretty weird sense of, or at least for many people, right, a pretty weird sense of knowledge then, that you can say you know something, but you're not actually certain of it, right? So that's just a glimpse of the sorts of issues of this kind of problem that the epistemologist or somebody interested in epistemology would wrestle with. Okay. Then we have a very related branch of philosophy known as metaphysics. And this is a sort of branch of philosophy that's concerned with what's real, what exists. Okay. Think movies like The Matrix. Is this really happening, or am I just dreaming? That sort of thing. If you guys have ever woken up within a dream, right? That's really weird too, right? You think you're awake, but then you're actually still dreaming. You just woke up within the dream, right? That gets you kind of thinking philosophically, right? And metaphysics is that sort of thinking. What's really happening? Is this a simulation? Right? What's his name? Neil deGrasse Tyson recently said, more likely than not, right, that we are just in a simulation. I don't know how what they base that sort of probability on, but anyway, all those are kind of interesting facets of metaphysics. Right? What really exists? One aspect of philosophy of mind, which is a branch of metaphysics, right, is does the mind exist? Right? What do we mean by the mind? Right? What do we mean by thought? Okay, when somebody thinks something, is that just neurons firing in certain ways, or are thoughts and thinking indicative of some sort of existence that's separate from physical material stuff, right? Is our thinking indicative of a kind of spiritual or mental existence or reality that's different from the material world, right? So these kinds of questions, and that leads to materialism versus dualism debate, right? Is there one type of reality, everything's physical, right? So the person who says thinking is just neurons firing in certain ways, right? They're probably a materialist. Everything can be explained in physical terms, right? But other people want to say no, there's something unique or different going on that can't be explained physiologically, right? A dualist would say something like that. Those sorts of issues, that's metaphysics, right? It's dabbling in, issues of what's reality, what exists. Okay, that's metaphysics. Logic, which will be the subject of our second lecture, right? This deals with reasoning and arguments. What is an argument? that might seem pretty straightforward, but even that is actually a lot more challenging for a lot of people than you might think, right? Figuring out what an argument actually is and whether you have an argument in front of you, right? Abortion's wrong. That's not an argument. It doesn't matter how strongly somebody screams that, right? That in itself is not an argument. And as we'll learn in lecture 2, right, when we talk about logic in more detail, there's something more that's needed. You can't just scream out, right, or abortion's okay, right? You can't just scream out a conclusion. That's not an argument in and of itself, right? So figuring out, what an argument is, and then more importantly, figuring out whether it's any good, that's what logic's all about, okay? And very important. And I'll try to sort of emphasize why that's the case when we get to lecture 2. Okay? But that is a significant branch of philosophy. And then we have finally, of course, our branch, what we're going to spend the remainder of the course studying in more detail, ethics. Okay? What is evil? What's right? What's wrong? What's good? What's evil? Those sorts of questions. What's the nature of morality? How do we figure these kinds of things out? Where do we get our moral compass, right? That's a common phrase you might have heard of, right? How do we figure out what is right and what is wrong? What kinds of actions should we engage in, and which should we refrain from? All these types of questioning, right? This type of questioning, that would belong to ethical philosophy. That's what we're up to, and when we're doing ethical philosophy, we're concerned with those kinds of questions. So, and that's a nice segue then into the next part of the lecture, right? Where we're going to home in more and talk about in more detail this, right? Ethics, ethical philosophy. We'll talk more about that in much more detail. Before we get to that, though, right, I'm going to end with just mentioning, right, what you should be doing. There is a supplemental reading, and it's like 1 page long. It looks like this. I think it's at the bottom if you scroll down on the home page for the course, right? You read that, okay, just 1 page, and then if you want to answer the intermission questions for lecture 1, right, for your post, you pick one of these. And remember, you want to offer a substantive, thorough, thoughtful response, okay? Or you can respond to something somebody else said already to one of these, okay? You don't have to do the intermission questions. You can wait to do the questions at the end. But we'll leave this part of the lecture with this then, with this here. And we'll pick up again part 2 of the lecture by discussing, okay, ethical philosophy in much more detail.